In the autumn of 1912, the whaling vessel Ariosto departed the port of Hokkaido with a crew of 31 men and provisions for 6 months at sea. By the 43rd day of the voyage, only 7 of those men were still alive. What destroyed the Ariosto has never been officially explained. My name is Edmund Farrell. I was 24 years old when I shipped aboard the Ariosto as a second-class harpooner out of Aberdeen, Scotland, having spent the previous 3 years working the North Atlantic cod runs and 2 seasons on a Norwegian whale ship out of Tromsø. I am 81 years old as I speak these words into this recorder. I've told this story only 4 times in my life, and each time I have told it, I have left something out. Not because I wish to deceive anyone, but because there are parts of it that I still cannot explain in language that other people will accept without deciding that I am either a liar or a madman. I am neither. I am an old man who saw something in the Pacific Ocean in October of 1912 that has followed me through every year of my life since, appearing in my sleep without warning, rearranging itself in my memory the way a tide rearranges stones on a beach. Always the same stones, always a slightly different pattern. I want to be precise about the details because precision is all I have left. The Ariosto was a steam-assisted bark-rigged whaling vessel approximately 140 feet in length, displacing roughly 480 tons. She had been built in 1887 in Dundee, Scotland, and had operated for 25 years across the North Atlantic and the Pacific without any significant incident of record. Her captain was a Dane named Jørgen Eriksson, a man of 53 with a face like salt-cured leather and eyes the color of the sea on an overcast morning. He had been working the Pacific sperm whale grounds for 11 years and knew those waters the way a farmer knows his fields. He was not a reckless man. He was not a fanciful man. Whatever Eriksson believed in the end, in those final hours, I believed too. We departed the port of Otaru on the 14th of September 1912, bound for the deep pelagic grounds south and east of the Bonin Islands. The season had been fair. The North Pacific was producing good numbers of sperm whale on the eastern migration routes, and Eriksson had a charter arrangement with a processing company in San Francisco that required him to deliver a minimum of 300 barrels of rendered oil before the end of November. He intended to work the grounds hard and return with full tanks. The first 3 weeks of the voyage were ordinary in every respect. We passed south of the Bonin chain in late September and turned east-southeast into open water. The weather was cooperative. The seas ran 2 to 4 feet with a long Pacific swell that the Ariosto rode easily. We sighted our first sperm whale group on the 28th of September, a pod of 6 animals running south about 12 miles northeast of our position, and Eriksson put us after them with the engine and sail both working. We took 2 that afternoon, about a mature bull measuring approximately 60 feet and a younger cow of perhaps 42 feet, both killed cleanly and secured alongside within 3 hours. The crew was in good spirits. The work was going well. There was nothing about those early weeks that would have made any reasonable man suspect what was coming. I want to spend some time describing the crew because I think it matters. These were not inexperienced men. The Ariosto carried 31 souls, including the captain. The first mate was a New Zealander named Thomas Bright, who had been working deep water for 15 years. The second mate, a man named Cornelius Voss, was Dutch, perhaps 40 years old, and had sailed the Pacific 3 times previously. The harpooners were myself, a Faroese man named Peter Johansen, who stood nearly 6.5 feet tall and had arms like anchor chains, and a Hawaiian named David Makoa, who had grown up fishing these same waters and whose grandfather had been a deep-sea fisherman himself. The rest of the crew was a mixture of nationalities common to deep-water vessels of that era. Men from Scotland, Norway, Portugal, the Philippines, Japan, and Hawaii. Most of them with between 5 and 20 years of seafaring experience. I mention this because I want you to understand that when these men became frightened, when hardened ocean workers with decades of experience between them began to show the kind of fear I will describe, it was not the fear of ignorant or superstitious men, and it was the fear of men who knew the sea very well and were confronted with something that exceeded everything they knew. We worked the grounds productively through the first 2 weeks of October. By the 15th of that month, we had taken 9 whales and rendered approximately 210 barrels of oil, which was good progress toward Ericsson's delivery commitment. The captain decided to push further, south and east, into deeper water, following reports from another vessel, a Norwegian ship called the Helveson, that had communicated by flag signal of a large sperm whale concentration approximately 200 miles east-southeast of our position. This decision to move further east is the one I've thought about most in the 70 years since. Had we stayed on the established grounds, and had Ericsson been satisfied with his progress and turned for San Francisco, I would have lived a different life. 31 men would have gone home. Instead, we pushed east into water. I do not believe any whale ship had worked that particular season, into a part of the ocean that was very deep and very far from any established shipping lane, and we found what we found. The first indication that something was different about those waters came on the morning of October 17th. I was on the 4 o'clock watch with a young Portuguese sailor named Ferreira and an older Japanese crewman we called Tanaka-san, which was not his full name but what we called him by common usage. The night had been flat calm, which was itself unusual. The Pacific does not often go entirely flat. There is almost always some movement. There's some respiration of the water. But that night, the sea was glass from horizon to horizon. The stars reflected perfectly below us, as above, and the Ariosto sat motionless on the surface, making perhaps 2 knots under reduced steam and no sail. At approximately 4:30 in the morning, Tanaka-san touched my arm and pointed over the starboard rail into the water below. I looked where he was pointing. At first I saw nothing, then I saw it. Below the surface, perhaps 20 to 30 feet down, there was a shape. It was large. I cannot give you precise dimensions because it was dark and the water, while calm, was not perfectly clear at that depth, but the shape was elongated, and it was moving parallel to the ship on the starboard side, keeping our pace with what appeared to be almost no effort. I watched it for perhaps 45 seconds before it descended and was lost in the darkness below. I want to be precise about my reaction at that moment. I was not immediately frightened. I was puzzled. In my experience, large marine creatures sometimes traveled alongside ships, attracted by the noise of the engine or the disturbance of the hull. Sperm whales, pilot whales, basking sharks, even large manta rays had been observed running alongside vessels I'd worked on before. My first thought was that it was a sperm whale, perhaps a solitary bull following the ship at depth. This was not unusual behavior for sperm whales. I reported what I had seen to the watch log and mentioned it to Bright when he came up at 6 o'clock. He listened, made a note, and said he would mention it to the captain. Nothing more was made of it that day, and we went about our work. The weather remained calm and the sea stayed flat, which Ericsson found useful for the chase. We sighted a group of 4 sperm whales in the late afternoon of the 17th and pursued them until dark without success, the animals sounding repeatedly and outpacing us in the deep water. Ericsson decided to hold position overnight and resume the chase at first light, as the whales had been traveling on a consistent bearing, and he expected to find them nearby in the morning. That night, the second indication came. I was below in the crew quarters when I felt it. A vibration. Not the vibration of the engine, which I knew intimately after weeks aboard. Not the groan of the hull working in a swell, but a different sensation entirely, a low and rhythmic pressure that seemed to come from directly beneath us. I transmitted through the planking of the hull and into the wooden bunks and the soles of my feet when I stood. It lasted perhaps 3 minutes and then stopped. I was not the only one who felt it. Ferreira and 2 other men in the quarters sat up at the same time. We looked at each other. No one spoke for a moment. I put on my boots and went up on deck. The night was still flat calm. The sea was dark and motionless under a half moon. I walked to the rail and looked down into the water on the port side. Nothing was visible, but I noticed that Johansen, who had the night watch, was already standing at the starboard rail looking down with an expression I had not seen on him before. I walked over and stood beside him. He said to me, quietly, that he had been feeling the thumping for the past 20 minutes. He said it came and went. He said it felt like something was walking the bottom of the ship. The bottom of the ship. Those were his words. I stood there with Johansen for perhaps an hour in the middle of the night on flat, calm water, and during that hour the vibration returned twice more, each occurrence lasting between 2 and 4 minutes, each one seeming to originate from slightly aft of amidships on the keel, as if something below was moving slowly from bow to stern along the bottom of the hull. Then it stopped completely and did not return that night. In the morning, Eriksson was told of the vibrations. He came up on deck and walked the length of the ship slowly, examining the hull from every angle possible from above the waterline. He asked Johansen and me to describe what we had felt in precise detail. He listened carefully, and then he said that the most likely explanation was that we had drifted over a thermal vent or some submarine geological feature during the night, and that the vibrations were the result of heated water movement against the hull. This explanation was plausible. It was the explanation I chose to believe for the next 24 hours, because it was the explanation that allowed me to sleep. I did not sleep on the night of October 19th. That was the night the shadows began. We had remained in the same general area, unable to raise the sperm whale group we had been following. The weather was still exceptionally calm for the season, and Eriksson was using the opportunity to make minor engine repairs that were easier performed on flat water. The ship lay to overnight with minimal steam, barely holding position. And the moon was fuller than the night before, and the water in that extraordinary Pacific calm was genuinely luminous with reflected light, so that from the deck one could see down into the surface layer, perhaps 10 or 15 feet. I was on the late watch, midnight to 4, with Macoa and a young Scottish sailor named McPhee, who had joined the Ariosto on his first deep-water voyage. McPhee was 18 years old and had the kind of open, eager face that young men carry before the sea has worked it into something harder. I mention him because he was the one who saw it first. McPhee was at the bow, and he called back to us in a voice that was not quite steady. Just our names. Nothing more. Just Farrell and Macoa, spoken at a volume that meant come here without shouting. We went forward. Below the bow, visible in the moonlit water, there was a shadow. It was not the shadow of the ship. The ship's shadow fell to the east under that moon. This shadow was beneath us, in the water, at a depth I estimated at between 40 and 60 feet, and it was moving forward at the speed of the ship with the slow patience of something that was not working to maintain the pace. It was simply there, keeping position below us, the way a remora keeps position beneath a larger fish. I am not going to tell you I knew immediately what I was looking at. I'm going to tell you the truth, which is that I did not know what I was looking at. The shadow was very large. It was horizontal and elongated, wider at one end than the other. In the moonlit water at that depth it had no detail, no texture, only mass and movement. My mind went through the obvious possibilities in the way a mind does when it is trying to avoid the conclusion that is forming at its edges. It was a whale. It was a large shark. It was a submarine geological formation we were passing over. It was a trick of moonlight on the water. It was none of those things, and some part of me that had been going to sea since I was 16 years old knew that it was none of those things. Macoa said nothing for a long time. He stood at the bow rail looking down with his arms at his sides and his face completely still. Then he said, in a voice that was careful and controlled, that it was very large. I said yes. He said he had never seen anything that large in these waters. I said I had not either. He said his grandfather had told him stories about what lived in the deep Pacific. He said his grandfather had been a man who did not tell stories idly. I asked him what his grandfather had said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said his grandfather had spoken of the old ones, the things that were in the ocean before people were on the land. He said his grandfather had told him that some of those things were still there in the deep places, and that they came up sometimes, rarely, when something disturbed their sleep or when they were drawn by the noise of creatures at the surface. He said his grandfather had told him that when you saw one from a ship, you turned the ship around and you did not look back. McPhee was white as chalk. He asked us what we should do. Makoa said we should wake the captain. We woke the captain. Erickson came up on deck in his night clothes and looked over the bow rail at the shadow. I watched his face carefully. I saw the same process I had gone through myself, the visible working of a rational mind trying to construct an ordinary explanation for what it was seeing. I saw the moment the ordinary explanations ran out. It lasted only a fraction of a second, that moment, and then his face composed itself back into the deliberate calm of a man who commanded other men and understood that his composure was a structural element of their survival. He looked at the shadow for perhaps 2 minutes, then he straightened up and said that we would maintain our heading. He said that whatever it was following the ship at depth and showing no aggressive behavior. He said that many large pelagic creatures followed vessels, and that there was no reason to alter course based on an unidentified shadow in the water. And he said these things firmly and clearly. I believe he was telling them to himself as much as to us. He went below, and I do not think he slept. The shadow was still below us at first light, when it finally descended back into depths beyond visibility. In the morning, we searched the water around the ship carefully and saw nothing. The sea was still calm. The engine was running, everything was ordinary in the daylight, and the shadow was gone, and men talked themselves back toward normalcy the way men do, by making jokes about it, by suggesting mundane explanations, by deliberately not talking about it at all. But the conversation I had with Makoa stayed with me, the things that were in the ocean before people were on the land. I have spent the past 70 years reading everything I can find about the natural history of the ocean, and I have read the scientific literature on marine megafauna. I have read the fossil records and the geological surveys. I have read the accounts of naturalists and oceanographers. I have read the work of researchers who study the deep Pacific specifically, and I have found, buried in those readings, certain facts that a man less personally motivated might have passed over without attention. The creature known to science as Carcarocles Megalodon was a species of shark that is estimated by researchers to have reached lengths of between 50 and 60 feet, with some fossil evidence suggesting specimens that may have been larger. Its teeth, which are found in oceanic sediment deposits worldwide, indicate jaws capable of exerting a bite force many times greater than any living predatory species. The mainstream scientific position is that Megalodon went extinct approximately 3.5 million years ago, following the closure of the seaway between North and South America, which disrupted the marine ecosystems that supported the species. The mainstream scientific position is not the only position. I have read accounts collected from Pacific Island communities, from deep-sea fishermen, from Polynesian oral traditions maintained across centuries of encounters with enormous sharks, sharks far beyond the size of the great white, sharks that surfaced rarely and in specific oceanic regions associated with deep abyssal trenches and seamount systems. These accounts have been dismissed by the scientific community as folklore, as misidentification, as exaggeration. I dismissed them myself for many years, and not because I could not believe in the existence of a large unknown shark, but because the specific accounts I read before the autumn of 1912 never seemed precise enough to trust. After October of 1912, I did not dismiss them anymore. On the morning of October 20th, I was on the port rail watching the water in the early light when Tanaka-san came and stood beside me. He had been on the ship 5 years and had sailed the Pacific for 20 before that. He was a man of perhaps 55, compact and careful, who spoke limited English but communicated with remarkable precision. He pointed at the water and then put his hands together in front of him with fingers spread, then spread them slowly outward, indicating something large. Then he held his right hand flat and swept it slowly from left to right, indicating a shape passing. Then he pointed at himself, at his chest, and shook his head slowly twice. I asked him if he had seen it before. He considered the question, then he said one word in English. Old. He said it the way you would say it about a mountain, or about a law. Not old like a person is old. Old like the earth is old. I thought about that word for a long time. The evening of the 20th brought our first sound. I have tried many times to describe this sound to people who were not there, and I have never been entirely satisfied with any description I have given. I will try again here. It was a low sound. Not a call or a vocalization in any recognizable sense. More like a pressure. A compression of air somewhere in the lower registers of hearing. Something you felt as much as heard, vibrating in the chest and in the back of the skull. It came from the water on the starboard side, somewhat forward of amidships, at approximately 8 o'clock in the evening. It lasted perhaps 10 seconds. Then it ceased. Several men came up from below immediately. They had all felt or heard it, and the expressions on their faces as they came up the companionway in the half-dark were expressions of men who had been pulled out of their ordinary thoughts by something they did not want to investigate but could not ignore. Ericsson appeared. He stood at the starboard rail and looked out at the water. The sea was still calm. The surface was dark. There was no moon yet, and the starlight gave only minimal illumination. Ericsson stood at the rail for a long moment and then said that it was likely a whale singing at depth. Added that sperm whales were known to produce low-frequency sound, and that in flat, calm conditions, the sound was sometimes transmitted through the hull in unexpected ways. The sound came again at 11:30 that night. It was louder. I need to tell you about what I am going to call the Day of the Fish. On the morning of October 21st, the men on the early watch found the deck partially covered in small fish. Not thrown there by a wave, for the sea was still calm. Not the result of any net or equipment failure. Hundreds of small fish, various species, sardines and anchovies, and small mackerel, scattered across the forward deck and covering an area perhaps 30 feet long and 15 feet wide. Many were still alive when discovered, flapping weakly, and many more were dead. And they appeared to have launched themselves out of the water and landed on the deck during the night. This phenomenon is known to naturalists. There are documented cases of fish mass launching themselves out of the water when pursued by a large predator directly below them. The pressure wave generated by a very large, fast-moving animal ascending from below can in certain conditions cause a panicked mass exit of smaller fish at the surface. Ericsson knew this. I saw it in his face when he came up and looked at the fish covering his forward deck. He stood there for a long time looking at them, and then he said very quietly that we were going to alter course. He said it quietly, and he said it looking at the fish, not at any of the men around him. Then he turned to Bright and told him to bring the engine to 3/4 and take a heading of north-northwest. Bright started to ask a question, and Ericsson looked at him in a way that stopped the question in his throat. Bright went aft to the wheelhouse. We turned north-northwest. For the rest of that day, nothing happened. The sea was still flat. The engine ran well. We ate our meals. Men worked their watches. The ordinary routines of a ship at sea continued. There was tension in every conversation, but no one said directly what they were afraid of, because to say it directly would have required naming the thing, and naming it would have meant it was real. At dusk on October 21st, Ericsson appeared at the bow and stood there looking back in the direction we had come from for perhaps 20 minutes. I walked up beside him. He did not acknowledge me immediately. Then he said, without turning, that he had run from nothing in 28 years at sea. I said I knew that. He said the Pacific was 3 miles deep in places. I said yes. He said that men assumed they knew what was in the ocean because they could see the surface of it. I said nothing. He looked at me then, finally, and his face in the fading light had something in it that I had not seen there before. He said that a living Megalodon would need a food source at depth that supported its mass. He said that the deep Pacific trenches produced thermal vent ecosystems that were only beginning to be documented by science. He said that a species sufficiently adapted to abyssal depths could theoretically have persisted in those environments without human knowledge for longer than anyone would be comfortable acknowledging. He said this as a man says things that he has been working out privately and needs to say aloud once in order to stop thinking about them. Then he looked back at the dark water to the south, and he said that he had smelled it. I asked him what he meant. He said that in the last hour before he ordered the course change, he had stood at the stern and smelled something coming up from the water. He said it was a smell he had no reference for. Something ancient and cold and deep, like the bottom of the ocean itself had sent something up to the surface. He said he had been a whaling man his whole life, and he knew the smell of large marine predators, and this was not that. This was something older. He said nothing more about it that night. I remember that night very well because it was the last quiet night we had. We were 72 hours from the nearest shipping lane. We were approximately 800 miles from the nearest inhabited coast. The radio operator, a young man from Glasgow named Tennant, had sent a routine position report to the Hokkaido station that afternoon and received a standard acknowledgement. Nothing in our communications suggested anything other than a normal working voyage. We were alone out there in the deep Pacific, in the way that ocean ships of that era were genuinely alone. No satellites, no aircraft, no other vessel within 100 miles in any direction, and just the ship and the sea and whatever was in it. On the morning of October 22nd, there were no fish on the deck. But the vibrations had returned. They began at approximately 5:30 in the morning, and they were different from the first vibrations I had felt 5 days earlier. Those had been rhythmic and spaced, as if something were walking slowly beneath the keel. These were continuous, a low, steady pressure that caused the planking to vibrate under our feet and made small objects on the shelves in the galley rattle against each other. The engine was running at 1/3 of its normal speed. This was not engine vibration. Ericsson confirmed this personally by going below to the engine room and checking with the chief engineer, a meticulous Scotsman named MacDougall, who knew the Ariosto's machinery as intimately as he knew his own hands. MacDougall confirmed that the vibration was external, and that in his opinion something large was moving in close proximity to the hull on the port side. Ericsson ordered all men on deck. We stood at the port rail in the early morning light, 31 men looking at the water, and we saw it for the first time with any clarity. It was running alongside us at a depth of perhaps 20 feet, close enough to the surface that its upper profile was occasionally visible when the light struck the water at the right angle. The dorsal region was dark gray, almost black, and it was textured in a way that is difficult to describe precisely. Not the smooth skin of a modern shark, but something rougher, more heavily built, like looking at the surface of a boulder through water. It was maintaining our speed exactly. The bow wave of the ship was passing over and around it without deflection, which indicated the scale of what we were looking at, because our bow wave would have deflected around anything smaller than a very large whale. Johansen, standing beside me, began calculating out loud. He did this in a quiet, almost clinical voice, the voice of a man processing information in the only way he knew how. He said the visible portion of the animal, from what he could estimate to be the pectoral region forward to the head, which was not clearly visible in the water at that angle, was at minimum 40 feet. He said the tail, which he could see behind us trailing in our wake, extended another 30 feet or more at minimum, and he said he was looking at an animal that was conservatively 60 to 70 feet in length and probably larger, and that based on the width of the dorsal region it would weigh in his estimation several times more than the ship. No one spoke after he said that. I want to tell you what it felt like to stand on the deck of the Ariosto on the morning of October the 22nd and look down at that animal in the water beside us. I want to tell you because I do not think any description I can give will be adequate. But I want to try anyway, for the record, for the account, for whatever truth can be extracted from my memory of it at this distance of 60 years. It was like looking at something that should not exist and watching it exist anyway. There is a particular quality of fear that comes not from danger, but from the violation of your understanding of the world. I have been afraid many times in my life. I have been afraid in storms and in fights and in the trenches of the First War. The fear I felt in those situations was sharp and immediate and directed at a specific source. The fear I felt watching that animal in the water beside us was different in kind. It was the fear of watching the framework of reality adjust itself to accommodate something it had no room for. It was the fear of being wrong about what the world contains. We watched it for perhaps 10 minutes before Ericsson spoke. He said that we were going to increase speed to full ahead and continue on our current heading. So he said it calmly, and he said it to Bright, and Bright went to the wheelhouse, and the Ariosto's engine increased to full power, and we began to push through the water at approximately 7 knots, which was our maximum speed. The animal increased speed with us. It did not surge forward to match our acceleration. It simply was beside us at the new speed, as if the concept of effort was irrelevant to something of that scale. It maintained station alongside the port hull, with the same indifferent precision as before, and I watched it from the rail and felt something that took me a long time to name correctly. It was not quite hostility. It was not curiosity in the way a dolphin is curious, active, and playful. It was something colder than either of those things. It was the kind of attention that a thing pays to something it has already decided the nature of. It was assessing us. I believe that now with complete conviction. I believe that in those hours on October 22nd, that animal was running alongside the Ariosto and assessing the ship and the men on it with whatever cognitive apparatus it possessed, and I believe that what it was determining was whether we represented a threat or a food source or something else entirely. I believe it had done this before. I believe the fish on our deck the previous morning had been a byproduct of that same animal feeding at depth below us, that the mass exit of small fish from the water had been caused by the pressure wave of something enormous ascending from below toward the surface. Something that had then, for reasons of its own, declined to breach and continued to circle the ship at depth for another day and night before finally coming alongside in the early morning of the 22nd. I believe it had been watching us since the 17th of October. 5 days. At approximately noon on the 22nd, it dived. One moment it was visible in the water beside us, its huge grey shape filling the upper water column, and the next it had angled downward and was gone, descending so quickly and so cleanly that it left almost no disturbance at the surface. The tension on deck did not release when it vanished. If anything, it increased. The absence of a visible threat is not the same as the absence of the threat, and every man on that ship understood in his body that the animal was below us, not gone, simply below. During the 3 miles of black water under the keel, Ericsson called a meeting in the main cabin with himself, both mates, and the harpooners. He told us what we already knew, that we were being followed by an animal of extraordinary size and that he was altering course for the nearest port, which was approximately 4 days of sailing to the northwest. He said that he did not believe the animal was overtly hostile, but that its size made any interaction potentially catastrophic and that he was not willing to continue working the grounds under these conditions. He said we would maintain full speed and maximum watch rotation until we were clear of the area. Voss asked him what he thought it was. Ericsson said he did not know. Makoa said, from the corner where he had been sitting quietly, that he knew what it was. He said it in a level voice without drama. He said it was one of the old ones. He said his grandfather had described an encounter his own father had witnessed from a fishing canoe in the deep Pacific 3 generations back, in which a shark so large it had made the 40-foot canoe look like a leaf on the water had surfaced alongside them, opened its jaws wide enough to swallow the entire vessel, and had then descended again without attacking. He said his great-great-grandfather had turned the canoe and paddled for shore without looking back, and had never returned to those waters in his life. No one said anything for a while. Then Erickson said that we would maintain full speed and set watches. The animal returned at dusk. I was at the stern on watch when I saw the wake disturbance. Not the animal itself. Not yet. But the bow wave of something large moving directly behind us at speed, a V-shaped spreading disturbance in the water that was wider at its origin point than any natural wave formation I had ever seen. I called to Makoa, who was at the rail amidships, and he came aft and looked at the disturbance, and he said one word: "Run." Erickson was already at the stern by then, having been on deck since the meeting. He looked at the disturbance. He went to the speaking tube and told McDougall in the engine room to give him everything the engine had. McDougall acknowledged, and a few moments later the engine took on a deeper note, and the ship surged forward perceptibly. The disturbance in our wake maintained pace. We watched it for perhaps 20 minutes, this V-shaped spreading wave following us through the darkening Pacific. And during those 20 minutes I felt the vibrations in the hull again, much stronger than before, a rhythmic, deep thumping that I could feel in my teeth and in the bones of my feet, as if something below us were striking the hull from beneath with regular, patient, deliberate force. McPhee was at the port rail. He was 19 years old, and he was gripping the rail with both hands, and his knuckles were white, and he was looking over the side at the black water below, and I could see him trying to control his breathing in the way a young man does when he is more frightened than he has ever been in his life, and he does not want to show it. I went to him, and I told him to look forward, not at the water. I told him to keep his eyes on the horizon. And he nodded and turned forward and stared at the dark horizon, and his grip on the rail loosened slightly. The thumping intensified. At approximately 9 o'clock in the evening, there was a single, massive impact from below the stern that threw several men off their feet. I was thrown against the stern rail and caught myself. Erickson, who had been at the binnacle, was knocked to his hands and knees. The impact was not gradual, not a building pressure, but a single explosive concussion from directly below the keel at the stern, as if something of extraordinary mass had struck the hull from below at speed. The ship shook. Every timber, every joint, every piece of ironwork and fittings on the Ariosto trembled from that impact. Several objects fell in the galley. Then McDougall came up from the engine room within 60 seconds and said there was no visible damage to the engine mounts or the propeller shaft, but that the hull planking at the stern had been struck hard enough to open some of the caulking, and that he was getting water in the bilge below the stern cabin. Erickson told him to pump. He told Bright to check the stern structure. He stood at the center of the deck, and he looked around at his men, at 30 faces, and I saw him perform the calculation that a captain performs in a crisis, counting what he has to work with, measuring what he can control. He said everyone to their posts. We went to our posts. Nothing more happened for the next 2 hours. The pumps ran in the bilge. Bright reported that the stern planking was strained but intact, and that the caulking could be repacked, and that there was no structural failure. The vibrations subsided. The wake disturbance behind us faded. The engine ran steadily. In the complete darkness of the open Pacific, with no moon yet and the stars very bright above us, the Ariosto pushed north-northwest at full speed, and everything was quiet, except for the engine and the water moving under the bow. Men began to breathe again. I should have known better. 20 years at sea had taught me that the sea gives false peace with the same indifference it gives storms. At 4 minutes past midnight on October 23rd, the animal breached. I am going to be very precise about what I saw, because I have had 70 years to organize the memory, and I am going to tell it as accurately as I can. I was on watch at the bow. The night was very dark, and I was looking forward, as I had told McPhee to look forward, watching the horizon and listening to the water moving under the bow and trying not to think about what was below us. The breach happened on the port side, approximately 40 feet from the ship's rail. It came out of the water with a speed and mass that my mind still struggles to process fully. One moment there was dark water on the port side. Then there was something else, an eruption of white water and spray, and then, above the spray, the underside of an animal, the cream white of its belly against the black sky, scaling upward with a momentum that suggested the animal had been moving at tremendous speed when it left the water. It went up perhaps 30 feet above the surface before it reached the apex of the breach, and for one moment it was entirely out of the water and visible against the night sky. I need to tell you what it looked like in that moment. It was enormous in a way that did not immediately register as biological because nothing in my experience as a living organism had prepared me for that scale. The body was torpedo-shaped in the way that all large sharks are torpedo-shaped, but the proportions were different from any shark I had seen. Deeper through the trunk, with pectoral fins that from below looked like the wings of an aircraft, wide and swept and substantial. The head was broad, very broad, with a width that suggested a jaw of dimensions I could not immediately calculate and did not want to. The skin was dark gray above and white below, in the classic counter-shading of a pelagic predator, but the scale of it made the pattern strange, made it look less like the natural camouflage of an animal and more like the markings on a piece of geography. The tail, as it cleared the water, was enormous, and it swept as the animal reached the apex of the breach and began to fall. The water it displaced when it came back down hit the Ariosto like a wave. The ship rolled hard to starboard. Men were thrown. I went down on the deck and slid toward the starboard rail and caught one of the stanchions and held on. I heard shouting from amidships and from aft. The ship was rolling back now, the port rail going down toward the water, and I scrambled to keep my footing on the wet tilting deck. When the ship steadied, I went back to the port rail and looked at the water. The animal was there, and it was at the surface now, wallowing on the port side, its dorsal fin above the water, and in the starlight I could see it clearly for the first time without the filter of depth. The dorsal fin alone was taller than a standing man. The width of the animal's back, visible above the waterline, was greater than the width of the ship. I'm saying this plainly, and I need you to understand that I am not exaggerating for effect. I am describing what I saw. The width of the visible dorsal surface of that animal was greater than the 14-foot beam of the Ariosto's deck. I looked at it, and I looked at the deck under my feet, and I performed that comparison, and I understood what it meant. We were smaller than it was in every dimension that mattered. We were not a threat to it. We were not its equal in any sense. We were in its water, eyes on its ocean, above its world, and it had decided to pay attention to us. Eriksson was at the rail 30 feet from me, looking at the animal with his hands gripping the rail and his face completely still. I watched him watch it. I watched the moment he understood what he was looking at, with the same completeness I'd understood it. He turned to Bright and he said, quietly, that he wanted all hands on deck. Bright called all hands. 31 men came up on deck and stood at the port rail looking at the animal in the water beside the ship. There was silence. Not the silence of men who had nothing to say, but the silence of men who had nothing adequate to say. The animal lay at the surface, and it was longer than the ship. I walked the length of the deck, counting strides, and the dorsal fin tracked me as I moved. A slow quarter turn of the body in the water. That is when I understood that it was watching me specifically, that it had eyes and that those eyes were in use, that whatever was behind those eyes was processing information and making assessments in the way that a mind makes assessments, not with our complexity or our language, but with the cold, precise efficiency of something that had been the apex of its world for millions of years and knew exactly what it was looking at and what it could do with it if it chose. It was choosing. That is the thing I have never been able to communicate adequately to anyone who was not there. It was choosing. It lay beside our ship in the black Pacific night, and it was choosing. Every moment that it did not act was a choice. The action and the restraint were equally deliberate. Makoa was beside me. He was looking at the animal with an expression that I did not fully understand at the time and have thought about since. It was not terror, though I am certain he was frightened. It was something else, something closer to recognition. He said very quietly, in a voice meant only for me, that it was old. I said I knew. He said that things this old had a different relationship to time than we did. He said that for something this old, a ship and all its men might be a curiosity, or a disturbance, or nothing at all. He said the important thing was what we represented to it in these particular waters at this particular time, and that what we represented was an intrusion. He said that in his grandfather's tradition, the old ones of the ocean were territorial. Not the way wolves were territorial, not with aggression and teeth first, but with patience. He said they would observe, and they would wait, and they would give a long time for the intruder to leave on its own terms. He said that we had been given that time, from the 17th to the 23rd, 6 days of signs and warnings and shadows and sounds, and now it was deciding whether the warning had been sufficient. I asked him what would happen if it decided the warning had not been sufficient. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that his grandfather had told him only one other account, beyond his great-great-grandfather's story, of a vessel that had not left when it was warned. He said the account was not long, because there was not much to tell. He said the vessel did not return to port. Ericsson had heard this. He was 3 feet away, at the rail, and the ship was quiet, and Makoa had not been whispering exactly. He looked at Makoa, and he said nothing for a moment. Then he turned to MacDougall, who had come up from the engine room and was standing at the back of the group on the port side, and he said that he wanted everything the engine could give. He said it for the second time in as many hours, but differently now, with a finality that contained his full understanding of the situation. MacDougall went below. The engine note deepened. The Ariosto began to move forward, slowly at first, and then building. 7 knots, our maximum. The water foamed under the bow. The animal in the water beside us did not move for a long moment. It lay at the surface, and it was enormously still, and in that stillness it was more frightening than it had been when it breached. And then it rolled slightly, and its eye, the one facing the ship, came briefly above the waterline, and I saw it in the starlight. A large eye, very large. Dark, almost black, perfectly circular, set into a head that from 10 feet away in the dark was wider than a man was tall. And in that eye, which I know I cannot scientifically characterize in the way I'm about to, there was something that I can only describe as age. Not life, not awareness in the way a whale has awareness, or a dolphin has awareness, but something deeper and less individuated than that. The age of something that has seen oceans close and open, that has existed through changes in the world so vast that the existence of our species is a recent and brief episode in its history. The age of something for which we were not a particularly significant event. The eye was below the surface again. We were at full speed, leaving the animal behind. I stood at the stern and watched it diminish in our wake, lying at the surface, watching us go. Its dorsal fin was above the waterline, and it did not move to follow us. It simply lay there in the black water at the full extent of our wake's disturbance, and watched us leave. After perhaps 10 minutes, I could no longer distinguish it from the dark water around it. After 20 minutes, it was gone entirely. I went below, and I lay in my bunk, and I stared at the deckhead above me, and I listened to the engine, and I felt the vibration of the hull moving through the Pacific at 7 knots, away from what we had seen. I did not sleep. We had been running for approximately 4 hours, at perhaps 2 in the morning of October the 23rd, until when the impacts began again. They were more violent this time. The first one came from amidships, below the waterline on the port side, a single blow that rang through the ship like a hammer, striking an iron bell, deep and resonant and far too powerful to have been caused by any floating debris. The ship shuddered. The engine labored and then recovered. Ericsson was on deck immediately. The second impact came within 60 seconds of the first, from further aft, also on the port side, at roughly the same depth below the waterline. This one was accompanied by the sound of something giving way below, a crack and a groan that came up through the hull. These, and a moment later, MacDougall's voice came up through the speaking tube in the wheelhouse, saying that they were taking water forward of the engine room on the port side, and that the damage was serious. The third impact was directly below the keel amidships, and it lifted the bow of the ship perceptibly above the waterline. I felt it in my stomach and in my knees. Several men fell. The foremast shuddered, and the block and tackle at its peak swung wildly and then settled. From below came the sound of things falling and the sound of water. Ericsson told Bright to rouse all hands with life preservers. He told Tennant to get to the radio and transmit our position and situation immediately. He told MacDougall through the speaking tube to assess the hull breach and tell him how much time we had. I want to tell you about Tennant in these moments because he was 22 years old and he was frightened, and he went to the radio room and he sat down and he transmitted. I know this because I found his notes afterward, in his hand, in the recovered debris, notations on a pad beside the radio key, coordinates and a timestamp and the words hull breach, multiple impacts, possible sinking, and then the coordinates again, and then a line that was not part of the formal transmission, that he had written apparently for himself in those few minutes while the radio was transmitting, that said something very large below, and nothing more. Something very large below. Written by a 22-year-old radio operator from Glasgow, sitting alone in the radio room of a sinking ship in the middle of the Pacific. And while outside the hull, the ocean struck at the ship again and again, with a force that no known animal should have been able to generate. He was not wrong. He was exactly right. He wrote the most accurate description of what was happening that any of us produced in those hours. The fourth impact took out the rudder mechanism. I know this because Bright came up from the stern area and told Ericsson that the rudder was gone, that the impact had sheared the steering gear, and that we had no helm. We were moving forward under engine power, but we had no ability to steer. Ericsson received this information with the same composure he had maintained throughout, but I saw something shift in his face in that moment, a very subtle change in the set of his jaw. And I understood that the calculation he had been performing throughout the night had just returned a different result. He said to Bright that the boats needed to go out. Bright said the sea was calm, that the ship might still float. Ericsson said that without the rudder they had no ability to evade and that he was not going to wait. Bright began organizing the boat crews. What happened next happened very quickly, and I'm going to tell it as accurately as I can, while acknowledging that in the confusion and terror of those minutes, my perception of time was severely distorted, and my memory of the sequence of events may not be perfectly reliable. There were 2 whaleboats on the starboard side and 1 on the port. Ericsson ordered all 3 boats lowered. The port side boat was the first to go, and it was being lowered when the 5th impact struck, the largest single impact of the night, a blow to the keel amidships that came from directly below, with such force that the midship section of the Ariosto dropped visibly, the deck buckling slightly at the center, the mainmast swaying and then cracking at its base and coming down, the rigging falling across the deck in a tangle of ropes and canvas and ironwork that swept 2 men over the port rail into the water. I heard them shouting. One of them was McPhee. I heard his voice specifically, his young Scottish voice, shouting from the water on the port side, and then there was a sound from below the water, a displacement sound, a massive movement of water, and then McPhee's voice stopped. And I'm going to say that plainly and move on because I cannot dwell on it. I've dwelt on it for 70 years, and I know the cost of that. McPhee was 18 years old, and he went into the water, and he did not come up. The starboard boats were being lowered. Men were getting into them. Ericsson was at the starboard rail, organizing the loading, counting men. The ship was listing to port now. The hull breach below the waterline on that side was letting in water faster than the pumps could handle, and the list was increasing. I was at the starboard rail waiting for my place in the boat when the sixth and final impact came. This one did not feel like a blow from below. This one felt like the entire keel had been seized from beneath and shaken. The ship heaved, the bow going up and the stern going down. And then there was a sound that I will hear for the rest of my life if I live another 30 years. The sound of a ship's hull splitting open, a crack and a roar, and a tearing that seemed to last much longer than it actually lasted. And then the cold Pacific was around my ankles and then around my waist, and I was in the water. I will not detail the next several minutes at length because they are not the kind of minutes that can be detailed usefully. They were minutes of chaos and darkness and cold water and shouting and the sounds of the ship breaking apart, of things falling and of steam escaping from the engine room as the water reached it, and of men calling for each other in the dark. I found the starboard lifeboat overturned and I got underneath it and held on to one of the grab lines and I held on. So I could feel the pull of the ship going down pulling at me in the water and I held on to the grab line and I did not let go. The pull subsided, and then there was just the ocean, flat calm as it had been for days, and the debris, and the dark. I came up from under the overturned boat and I looked around. The Ariosto was gone. She had gone down very quickly once the keel was breached in that final impact, the way a wooden ship goes when the structural integrity is suddenly and completely compromised. There was debris everywhere in the water around me. Planking and rope and the contents of the galley and the crew quarters and the stores, scattered across the surface in a wide field that caught the starlight and made the water around it look almost luminous. I called out. Several voices answered. In the end, 6 other men came to the overturned boat, 7 of us in total. Ericsson was not among them. Bright was not among them. Makoa was among them. Johansson was among them. Tennant, the radio operator, was among them, having escaped from the radio room when the water came in. Ferreira was among them. The 7th was a young Norwegian sailor named Olav, who had been in one of the lowered boats and had found his way to us after his boat was swamped in the disturbance of the sinking. 7 men out of 31. We righted the boat over the course of the next hour with great difficulty, and we bailed it out, and we sat in it on the flat black Pacific, and we did not speak for a long time. I looked at the water around us. I looked at the debris field. I looked at the dark surface. The ocean was flat and completely calm and gave no indication of what it contained. After perhaps 20 minutes, Makoa said quietly that he did not think it would come back. I asked him why. He said it had done what it needed to do. He said he believed it had not been trying to kill us specifically. He said he believed that from its perspective, it had communicated what it needed to communicate and had enforced that communication when the communication was not acted upon promptly enough. He said he believed that where it had come from, where it was going, whatever deep Pacific territory it moved through in its long, slow cycles, we were simply no longer in it. We had been expelled. The ship was gone. The intrusion was ended. From its perspective, the matter was resolved. I thought about that for a long time. I was sitting in that lifeboat on the dark Pacific in the middle of the night, surrounded by the debris of the ship I had come out on. I thought about the 43 days of the voyage. I thought about the night watches and the whales and the good early work and the way the ocean had been cooperative and ordinary for 3 weeks before we pushed east into those deeper waters. I thought about Tanaka-san saying old in his careful, deliberate way. I thought about Makoa's grandfather and what he had been told and what he had passed down and what had been preserved across generations in a tradition that Western men of my era were inclined to dismiss as superstition. It was not superstition, it was knowledge. And it was the accumulated observation of people who had lived on and around the deep Pacific for centuries and had paid attention to what they observed and had organized what they knew into a form that could be transmitted across generations. And what they had transmitted was the truth. There are things in the deep ocean. There are things in the deep ocean that are old in ways that make the history of human civilization look like an afternoon. There are things in the deep ocean that have territorial ranges and behavioral patterns and responses to intrusion that we have no framework for, because we have spent our time as a species looking at the surface of things and assuming that what we can see represents what exists. As we were rescued on October 26th by a Japanese fishing vessel operating approximately 300 miles to the north of our position. The master of the vessel, a man of perhaps 60, heard our account through Makoa's translation and then was quiet for a long time. He said that he had fished the northern Pacific for 40 years and that his father had fished it before him and his grandfather before that. He said that the waters to the south and east of the Bonin Islands had been avoided by Japanese fishermen for generations. He said that in his family's tradition there was a name for what inhabited those deep waters, a name I cannot reproduce phonetically with any accuracy, but which translated approximately as the old wait or the deep sleeper. He said that in his family's understanding it surfaced once in a generation, and perhaps once in 2 generations, and that in the years following such a surfacing, the fishing boats gave the area a wide berth. He said that the last surfacing his grandfather had recorded was in the 1870s. He said he was sorry for our losses. I found this enormously moving at the time, and I find it equally moving now. He was sorry for our losses. He said it the way a man says it when he understands completely and sympathetically what has happened, when he has the context for it, when it makes sense to him. Not the way authorities say it when they are managing something they do not understand. Not the way the marine insurance investigators said it when they questioned us at the port of Yokohama in November. The investigators wanted a cause that fit into their framework. They went through every possibility systematically. To mechanical failure, structural failure, rogue wave, collision with underwater volcanic seamount, whale strike, and they could not fit any of those explanations to what 7 survivors described. They settled in their final report on structural failure of undetermined origin. This appears in the record as the official cause of the Ariosto's loss. I have seen the official record. I've read the official finding. Structural failure of undetermined origin. 7 survivors, 1 overturned lifeboat. The radio transmission from Tennant received by the Hokkaido station at 2:17 in the morning of October 23rd, reporting hull breach and sinking. All 31 men aboard accounted for, 24 lost at sea. What happened to us is not in the official record. That I was debriefed twice by the Japanese Maritime Authority and once by a representative of the British consulate in Yokohama, who was primarily interested in whether the loss of the ship was due to negligence by Ericsson or by the ship's owner, a Glasgow firm called Harvey & Sons, for insurance liability purposes. I told all 3 of these interviewers a version of events that omitted the creature entirely. I said that there had been unusual sounds and vibrations that suggested structural damage was developing over several days, and that a catastrophic failure of the keel structure had occurred in the early morning of October 23rd, that this failure had been rapid and severe, and that we had had barely enough time to get lifeboats away. And I said that the violence of the sinking had accounted for the injuries described by the survivors and for the rapid disappearance of the vessel. All of this was technically true. I was not asked about the specific cause of the keel failure. Had I been asked, I would have had to decide whether to tell the truth. I was not asked. I returned to Scotland in December of 1912, and I did not go to sea again for 11 years. When I returned to sea, I went to the North Atlantic, to the fishing grounds off Shetland and Iceland, far from the Pacific and its deep water. I fished those grounds for 30 years, and I was not a bad fisherman. I raised a family. I lived a life. I thought about what I had seen in the Pacific every day for many years, and then every week, and then at intervals that grew longer as I aged, but never disappeared entirely. There are some things that do not leave you. I have thought a great deal about what the experience means, if it means anything beyond itself. I am not given to mysticism, and I do not think what happened to us was mystical in any true sense. What happened to us was a natural event, a natural encounter between a species that had been on this earth for 20 million years, and a species that had been on this earth for perhaps 200,000 years and had been building ocean-going ships for perhaps 10,000 of those years. What happened to us was an old animal in its territory encountering something new, something it had not evolved alongside, something that was not in its deep instinctual memory the way whales and seals and its ancient prey species were, saying and making a determination about that something and acting on that determination. We were in its water. We were making noise in its water. We were hunting the prey of its water. We had been there for 6 days, and the signs it gave were clear, and we did not leave. So it made us leave. I do not think it was angry. I do not think it was afraid. I do not think it felt anything that a human emotional vocabulary can accurately describe. I think it was old, and it was large, and it was effective, and it had a territory, and we were in it, and we were gone. And then it was alone again in the deep Pacific, which is where it lived, which is where it had always lived, which is where it will live long after everyone who is on the Ariosto is gone, long after the Ariosto herself is dissolved into sediment, and long after the institutions and the cities and the nations that we move through on our way to that water are gone too. That is the thing about these encounters that I think human beings consistently fail to understand. We approach them as if we are the central element of the story. We tell them as if the creature's behavior toward us is the main event. But we are not the central element. We are the intrusion. We are the brief interruption in a life and a history so much longer than ours that our entire civilization is barely a moment in it. The whale shark that circles a diver is not curious about the diver. The diver is curious about the whale shark. These are not the same thing. The whale shark does not tell stories about the diver. The whale shark has no story about the diver because the diver was not significant enough to require a story. What happened to the Ariosto and her crew is a story for us. In the framework of what we encountered, it was not a story at all. I have been asked twice in my life by people who knew the full account whether I believed the animal was still there, whether I believed it was still alive in those deep Pacific waters south and east of the Bonin Islands. Both times I gave the same answer. I said that I had seen an animal that was clearly very old. I had seen an animal in excellent physical condition with no signs of disease or age-related deterioration. I had seen an animal that was deeply adapted to an environment that human beings had barely begun to explore. I said that the deep Pacific trenches, which in 1912 had never been dived and were almost entirely unexplored, were the most stable and isolated ecological environments on the planet, that they had changed very little in millions of years, that they were cold and dark and enormously pressurized, and that the human impulse was to think of these environments as inhospitable, but that an animal evolved over millions of years specifically for those environments would experience them as home. I said that I had no specific reason to believe it was dead. I said that I had no specific reason to believe it was alive. I said that the ocean is very deep and we have seen very little of it. I said that the old fisherman on the Japanese boat, the one who had been sorry for our losses, had described the interval between surfacings as a generation to 2 generations. And I said that by 1912, it had been approximately 40 years since his grandfather's recorded sighting in the 1870s. I said that by the time I was giving the interview, it had been 60 years since the Ariosto. I said that if the pattern held and intervals between surfacings were 40 to 60 years, then by the arithmetic, the next surfacing would be approaching or might have already occurred, without witnesses capable of surviving to report it. I said that the deep Pacific is very large and very dark and that most of it remains unexplored. I said these things, and then I said nothing more on the subject, because there is a point beyond which speculation serves no purpose. I am going to end this account where it needs to end, which is back on that lifeboat in the Pacific in the early morning hours of October 23rd, 1912. And 7 men in a lifeboat on flat, calm water, the debris of a ship around them, and 24 men lost to the sea. Makoa sitting in the stern with his hands in his lap, looking at the dark water and saying quietly that he did not think it would come back. The sky beginning to lighten very faintly in the east, the water so calm it reflected the fading stars. I sat in that boat and I thought about what I had seen. I thought about the breach, that animal clearing the water and hanging for one moment against the night sky, the scale of it, the life of it, the impossible aliveness of something that old and that large and that complete. I thought about its eye at the surface, that dark eye with its ancient patience. I thought about 6 days of warnings given by something that operated on a time scale where 6 days was probably not a long time to wait. I thought about the ocean, about how old it was, about how much of it was dark and deep and cold and full of things we had not yet found or named or understood. I thought about Ericsson, who had been a good captain and a rational man, and who had, in the end, understood completely. I thought about Tanaka-san saying old. I thought about Makoa's grandfather, who had told his son, who had told his son, who had told Makoa, who had told me, and about how the knowledge had traveled down through those generations because it was true, because it had always been true, because people who lived close to the water had always known that the deep ocean contained things that the surface world had no accounting for. And we were not the first people to go out onto that ocean. We will not be the last, but the ocean was there before us, and it will be there after us, and what lives in it, in the deep places, in the cold dark, will still be there when we are not. This is not a frightening idea to me anymore. It was frightening when I was young and had not had time to think about what it meant. Now, at 81, with most of my life behind me, I find it almost comforting. The old weight in the deep Pacific, patient in its dark territory, going about its ancient business, unmoved by the brief bright passage of our ships across its ceiling. There is something right about that. Something that has the quality of justice, or of order, or of a world correctly arranged. We think we know what the ocean contains because we sail on it. We think we know what the forest contains because we cut it down. We think we know what the deep earth contains because we dig holes in it. We have always been wrong about these things, and we have paid for that wrongness when we went far enough into the places we thought we knew. The Ariosto went far enough. I have not gone to the Pacific since.